So, typical technically, we're going to start kind of broad scale and talk about the system overall. Then what we'll do is we'll talk about some of the processes that are going to be involved, a little bit how we approach the digestive system, where there's going to be a number of things that are going to be necessary that need to happen in order for this whole system to successfully complete its job of digestion. So we'll talk about those processes. And then we will talk about, we know that there's a lot of different organs in this system, and we'll talk about, in essence, that there's two different kind of sets of organs in this system. One part of it is like the main street digestive system. And so this is really what we call the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract, okay? So that's the main street, if you will, for the digestive system, and the food passes through every section of that main street. Now along the way, we're going to have what are called accessory organs of digestion that are kind of side streets that come in along the way. They have some sort of function that they're going to add in to the overall system, but like I said, it's not right on Main Street. They're coming in at different places. And basically for these accessory organs, they are usually secreting something, or like we said, they're adding some sort of digestive function, but the food doesn't usually go into these side streets like that. You know, something comes out of it, like digestive enzymes or bile or something like that. It gets added to the food that's in that main street, that main gastrointestinal tract. Now that gastrointestinal tract, even though we say it's main street, does have different sections to it, right? So the mouth's going to be on that, and the pharynx, which is the back of the throat that we already learned about with respiratory system. Then, once we get the larynx, we get that separation between food tube and air tube, right? We're going to go with the esophagus, we're going to go down to the stomach, to the small intestine, where there's going to be 3 different sections of the small intestine, then large intestine with its different sections, etc. Okay? So, even though it's one big street, it has these different sections that are unique. And so what we'll do before we get into those unique sections is talk about, for that main street, at least what are the similarities to it? What are the layers of the wall and stuff like that? So at least we have a general understanding of it. And then what we'll do for the main part of the chapter is what we see in some of the other chapters, and that is we'll take a tour. So we will ourselves kind of take the same pathway that food would take. So we start up in the mouth, and we'll talk about the digestive functions and structures that are there, and work our way through the digestive system. At the very end of this chapter, we'll review talking about things like our different organic and non-organic molecules, but our organic molecules that are important in nutrients. So we'll talk about carbohydrates again, like we did way back in the chemistry chapter. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nucleic acids, and how they're important to us for our cells to use, and how this system is going to take the big macromolecules and large things that we ingest, and how all these organs are going to contribute to breaking these things down to small enough building blocks that we can absorb them across the body wall, transport them in the blood, get them into a cell, and the cell can then use them almost like Legos in order to assemble the things that it needs in order to survive. Okay? So that's what we'll wrap up with. That's why it says digestion and nutrition. That's the nutrition part. Okay. So the first thing is to understand this system and what it's doing for the body. How does it contribute to homeostasis and things like that? What's it looking to maintain in terms of our internal condition? So in this case, digestion is referring to the mechanical and chemical breakdown of foods that can then result in nutrients being absorbed by the cells. And so, that's pretty much what any of us would have said that our digestive system does. But when we look at it, there's one thing to know. It says mechanical and chemical breakdown. Like we were just saying, we take in fairly large things, like some sort of, double animal style from In-N-Out. You can imagine that you cannot jam that into a cell, right? But it's got a lot of different components that the cell is going to use, like we said, like carbohydrates and proteins and fats and things like that. So we need to break those things down, both mechanically, like your teeth crushing it, etc., but also chemically. So we're going to have to break chemical bonds, and rather than having these big, long, complex proteins that we couldn't absorb across the body wall, we need to chemically break those bonds and break them into, for instance, little amino acids that we can then use, and our cells can use, like in the rough endoplazmic reticulum, to assemble their own protein. Things like that. So, the digestive system is focused around that. And there's going to be both chemical and mechanical types of digestion that are going on. And each time we get to a digestive organ, we'll kind of highlight what of either of those two, or sometimes both of those two, it's contributing to in terms of digestion. Now, the digestion itself, we'll find, is only one major function. Because if we think about it, just on the anatomical level, a bit like the lungs, when we're talking about the lungs, right? It's one thing to ventilate the lungs, that's great. But if we didn't have like a circulatory system, and we didn't have that exchange that was going on, then all the rest of the cells around our body would just basically die, right? Maybe there would be some cells right near the lungs that'd be okay, right? Because they'd be close enough to actually have oxygen diffused and things like that. But everything else would just be screwed. So it's going to be very important with this system, if we have all these different organs that have to contribute, another essential function for this system is going to be what we call propulsion or movement. It's getting the food, issuing the food from one section to the next section to the next section, so each section can do its job. So we'll talk about more functions that are going to be important, but obviously digestion, the breaking down of these molecules is going to be very important. And that's why I like to think of, this system and the way it's laid out, it's a bit like, a factory, if you will, where they have an assembly line, right? And each segment along the assembly line, there's a worker or a station where they're doing something to that particular product that's slightly different than where it was before. And it's very important that the section of the station before it did its job before it reaches this area, right? And if this station is getting a little bit behind in terms of its workload and stuff like that, and things are piling up, that's going to be bad news, right? It's going to be bad news downstream, it's going to be bad news upstream, because there's going to be a backup. So there's got to be a communication system between these different segments, so that they're all coordinated with each other as well. And we'll talk about that too. But unlike the factory analogy, in a factory you start out with individual components, and then as you go through the assembly line, you end up with something that's more complex, right? We're the opposite of that for this system. We're starting out with something that is very complex, and then we're making it smaller, taking it apart and making it simpler. So this is really a disassembly line. So at each station along the way, we're going to be taking it apart a little bit more, until we're down to simple enough molecules that we can absorb it across the body wall and distribute to all the cells. Okay? So like I said, we've got anatomically this main street, like we were saying, which is the alimentary canal, right? And then, in addition to that, we have lots of different accessory organs that are going to help the process of digestion in some particular way, okay? So this can be things like the pancreas, it can be things like the salivary gland, it can be things like the liver, etc. So we'll talk about those as we kind of migrate our way through. So this figure right here is a pretty good summary figure showing you most of the different organs that we're going to be talking about. And so much like we were in the very first chapter of the book, and we had a diagram where it showed us 11 systems of the body and gave us a little synopsis about which one did what. This one shows us a lot of our different organs. And on the right side, we have those that are part of Main Street, part of the alimentary canal. And on the left side, we have those that are the accessory organs. So again, this is a good figure where you're just starting out and you're like, okay, well this is probably a pretty important section to know about the digestive system. If I know all these organs, if I can name them, and I can tell them what they do, that's a pretty good chunk, especially for something like the lab quiz, right? In the lab quiz, same type of thing. You're going to be pointing out what's that. Now, for the lab quiz for digestive system, which we moved to Monday, which is appropriate, I think there's enough, off the top of my head, of course you always have to read the question, but I think that there's enough, as you see here, different sections and organs and things like that, that I think when we're going through that lab quiz, it's just what's this, what's that, without the function. Okay? But, now always make sure that you read those. But this is what we're going to be doing in lab, and of course that's what we're doing in lecture. We're looking at these different organs. Okay, so let's start out simply and talk about that alimentary canal, that main street. Okay? Now we said with this main street, this is is where the food is going to be passing through. And so what we're going to find is some of the functions that occur in this main street are certainly going to be, like we were talking about already, it's going to be stuff like digestion. Oh, I'm going to take right there, hold on. So we're going to have digestion, where we're breaking things down. We're going to have propulsion, where we're moving things around as well. And remember, with digestion, it's both chemical digestion and physical digestion, right? Like if you're squeezing it, like churning in the stomach, or mashing it with your teeth. So we've got propulsion. We're going to find along the way that secretion is going to be important as well. So one of the things we said already is that our accessory organs, a lot of them secrete substances that then mix with the food and help them digest it. So that could be hydrochloric acid in the stomach, right? Gastric juice. Could be bile, like we were talking about before. There's lots of different things. It could be saliva, something as simple as that. So we have digestion, propulsion, secretion. We have ingestion. What's ingestion? Not indigestion. You sometimes think that too. So if you ingest something, what does that mean? It usually sounds bad. Like this patient ingested 5 quarters. But yeah, take it in, exactly. So, ingestion, when we look at these functions, many of these are going to occur in a lot of different organs along the way, or a lot of different segments, right? So, for instance, propulsion is going to occur at every different segment, or at least it should. If not, you're going to back up or something like that. You need a laxative. But it should occur in the mouth. We're going to propel it through there. It should occur in the esophagus, in the stomach, in the section of the small intestine, and in the large intestine, all the way through the rectum, the anus, right? So propulsion is going to be big, and it's going to occur everywhere along the way. Secretion is going to occur to a certain extent everywhere in that, and we'll see this coming up very soon, that this tube, this alimentary canal, on one end or the other, opens to the outside. That means that this, as an organ, and as all these organs are attached, is going to be lined with a mucous membrane. And so mucous membranes are always secreting mucus, right? It's part of our defenses, like we talked about, but it also helps to kind of mix with, in this case, food and things like that, and smooth the track. And so we're going to have mucus being secreted all along the way. So you can say secretion occurs at every single segment along this path too. But there's going to be some organs that secrete even more things, like we said, like gastric juice, etc. Ingestion is only going to occur in one place, right? In the mouth. Yeah. So, after that last semester, no joke, I had a student and I go, no, this is my 02 class, and she goes, oh yeah, but there's some people that do coffee enemas and stuff. And I'm like, oh yeah, but and she said, yeah, I do that. Okay, for most of us, ingestion occurs in the mouth. If you want to sit in the bathtub with a bag of coffee and do that, that's fine. But that really kind of spoils the smell of coffee for me in that way. Okay. So, anyway, ingestion, some of these things, ingestion occurs at only one place normally. And so, in some of these cases, the functions are only going to occur at distinct areas as well. So, when we look at this alimentary canal, like we said, it's going to be mucus lined. It's going to be similar overall, but it's going to have specializations along it too. So it's going to be about 9 meters long. Now, it depends on how big you are, right, as to how big your alimentary canal is. But 9 meters is about how many feet on average? How many meters? How many feet in a meter? Ballpark. Meters about the same as the yard. 3 feet. So it's about 3 feet a yard, about 3 feet in a meter, 9 meters. So 9 times 3? 27. So, as you can imagine, that really doesn't look like 27 feet. Okay? So there's got to be a lot of curving and winding that goes on there. And that's going to be a critical thing that we see with the digestive system. We'll also see it with the urinary system and the reproductive system coming up. Is that surface area is going to be big here. Because food, when it moves through here, we need it to move through these organs fairly slowly, or at least slow enough, so that the job of each of these different stations can be done before it goes to the next station, right? Because by the end of it, our goal is to have broken it down small enough that we can absorb it across the body wall. If it goes through too quickly, then you haven't had enough chance to break it down, and you're not going to get the nutrients you need out of it. So if you have bad tacos or something like that, and it goes through you fast, right? there's a chance you're going to get malnourished, you're going to get dehydrated, stuff like that, because you're not being able to pull from the food you've taken in and drink what you need out of it, okay? So we see a lot of surface area here, so there's a lot of length, and the length corresponds to time. The amount of time that the food's going to go through, we're going to be able to digest it more and more and more, okay? Okay, so it's about 9 meters long or so. The longest section of it, as you can see, and as you might imagine, is going to be the small intestine. Now, it's funny, a lot of people focus, in terms of the digestive system, they focus on the stomach, right? So, oh, my stomach is growling, my stomach is full, and his stomach is so big, and all this type of thing, right? But, in truth, if we look at the area, the sheer area of the alimentary canal, and you are going to gauge importance by size, this is 2/3 of that 27 meters, or I'm sorry, 27 feet. And so, this small intestine is actually probably the most important part of the digestive tract. In the small intestine is actually where most of the actual digestion occurs. And it's also the place where most all of the absorption occurs. And that's one thing that we didn't write up there, but that's another critical function for the system, right? So we certainly have to have absorption on there as a function for this system. Because, well, not even crowding out there, but at least you saw where it was before, absorption, if you go through all of these processes of breaking things down, and secreting things with it, moving it along, and mixing it, etc., but you're not able to absorb anything out of it, get it into the bloodstream, then your cells don't benefit. Okay? So absorption is going to be key. Now we talk about things like fiber, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end when we're talking about nutrients and things like that, or nutrition. Fiber is basically plant carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates from plants that our system doesn't digest very well. So, at least in terms of certain types of fiber. And so, with that fiber, the benefit of it is that it tends to move through the system and move other things through the system so that things can progress nicely, right? So you eat fiber if things are moving too slowly. And fiber in and fiber out. Your system can't digest it very well. So you don't really absorb too many nutrients from that. The benefit from it is that it actually moves things through. It can help, clean your colon and things like that, okay? But the other things we have that we're taking in as nutrients, we want to make sure that we're absorbing those nutrients from them. So we got to do that in the small intestine. Interestingly enough, when we get to the large intestine, that last 1.5 meters, that's basically cleanup crew. That's cleanup crew, a little bit like the lymphatic system, if you will. In that, most all of the nutrients we've already pulled out of the food that we've ingested, okay, in the small intestine. By the time it gets to the large intestine, we're just pulling out excess water, electrolytes like salt and stuff like that, and that's it. No nutrients, etc. It's storage, and then we're just going to pull out extra water and salt from it as we can while it's slowly moving through those last segments of the large intestine. So small intestine is very critical to the system. Not that, you shouldn't have a pancreas and a stomach and stuff like that, but people kind of downplay the importance of the small intestine, or at least they don't know about it. Okay, so that's a kind of broad view of the digestive system. So now what we want to do before we start doing our little pathway is we want to look at the alimentary canal in terms of what's similar about small intestine, stomach, esophagus, large intestine. Okay, we know there's going to be specialized parts of them that allow them to do their particular function, but what's going to be similar about them? They're all part of one tube, that alimentary canal, and they all have 4 layers. You see that word tunica again and again, right? Tunica is a layer. You saw blood vessels and things like that. You actually see it with the trachea, etc. And so with the alimentary canal, we have 4 layers, and the innermost layer, as you can imagine, is called the tunica mucosa, right? That's the mucus lining on the inside. We have a layer deeper to that, which is called submucosa, a muscularis, and then a serosa. You can see it rhymes, right? Mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. Okay, so I'm going to come back to these, okay? But here is a shot of, for instance, the small intestine. And when we look at it, we can see that this area here is going to be the mucosa, okay? So we have the mucosa, which is the innermost lining. We've got a submucosa here. We've got a muscularis, and the serosis just on the outside, very thin outer lining here. Okay. Now, the mucosa is the innermost. This is going to be the layer that's going to be in contact with the food. This is where we're going to have the mucus being secreted, etc. Now, it will look a little bit different in different areas of the anal now, but they're all going to have a mucosa. Okay. So the mucosa is epithelium. We know that's the covering and lining, right? It's connected via the connective tissue in the submucosa, and it helps to protect the canal, and it does have some secretion, right? Because that mucus is going to be secreted there, and even when you have glands underneath it, they're going to open up in that innermost layer of the mucosa, okay? And of course, if we're pulling it across the body wall, it's going to go across the mucosa first, so there's some absorption that occurs there too. But it's basically this inner mucus lining, okay? Next layer is the submucosa, right? Sub being underneath. And this is kind of a mixed-up layer. It's a little like skin, right? The outermost layer of the skin was just epithelium, right? Grandpa's mom's epithelium. What was it called? What's that? So the two layers of the skin on the outermost layer are called, we have up here. Epidermis, right? So epidermis was the outermost layer made of epithelium, covering lining, just like here. And then when we go layer underneath that, we have the dermis. And in the dermis, we have blood vessels going across it, glands in there, going after the cervix, connective tissue, a lot of different things there down in the dermis. The submucosa is a little bit like the dermis of the skin. Again, blood vessels going through there, glands that are secreting up to the mucosa, and things like that. Lymph vessels leading up after the blood vessels, nerves that can tell us what's going on in the alimentary canal, etc. Okay? So that's submucosa. Then we have the muscular layer, two muscularis. And this one is actually two different muscle layers within it. There's an inner, what's called circular layer, and then there's an outer longitudinal layer. Now, we have three different muscle types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. What type do you think this is? Make your intestines squeeze, your stomach churns, and things like that. Smooth. That's smooth, right? Skeletal is voluntary, right? We're moving the body voluntarily. Cardiac only found in the heart. This is going to be smooth. It's involuntary. It's going to be coordinated again by the brain and different kind of subconscious areas of the brain, but it's going to largely be operating at a subconscious level. Okay? So we're going to have different types of movements. We're going to have compulsive movements where we're squeezing it down, kind of like squeezing down toothpaste tube. We're going to have mixing movements like when you're kneading dough. This is not like when you're asking your parents for money. That's kneading dough your type, right? So we're talking about like KN, right? Like kneading dough like this. When you squeeze things together like that, it separates like this, and you squeeze it over here, it separates like that, and you can actually mix it just like squeezing it again and again. It does it in the stomach. It does it in the small intestine. It just cuts it up that way, back and forth, squeezing it. So these are the layers. In the muscular layer, it's going to do an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal. So circular is going to be able to, like blood vessels, it's going to be going around tube, and it's going to be able to kind of temporarily hinge off the tube. And so that way, it's just like a toothpaste tube. If we close it off, and then we use the longitudinal muscle to go whoosh, we can move it down that way, right? So longitudinal muscle will move the food along, and then the circular muscle will kind of either break up if we're talking about mixing movements, or kind of seal it off for a period of time so we can make sure it's moving kind of downstream, if you will. Okay? So that smooth muscle there in that muscular layer, and then the outer layer, like usual, is serosa or serous membrane. All of these organs are packed, right? 27 feet, but it's packed in. A lot of it's packed in the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's packed in there tight. And yet, movement is a big part of the system. So there's a lot of things moved by, squeezing and stuff like that. And so we don't want to generate friction. So on the surface of all the coils and stuff, we have a serous membrane. Lining the abdominal pelvic cavity, we also have a serous membrane. In this case, we call it peritoneum. So in the lungs, we call it pleura. In the heart, we call it pericardium. Now we call it peritoneum. So in the outer layer of the intestine or the alimentary canal, most of it, we call it visceral peritoneum. and then there's a parietal that lines the cavity itself. Okay. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at these various layers of the alimentary canal. And so the mouth can have all 4 layers, and the esophagus, and the stomach, etc. Now, those layers may look a little bit different in each area. What we're seeing there is the small intestine. You see all these little finger-like appendages that are coming up through the mucosa. Those finger-like appendages called villi, we only find in the small intestine. And they're very important is giving that much more surface area, right? So if I have a surface that's just flat like this, well, this is my surface area for digesting things or absorbing things. But if now all of a sudden like this, okay, now I have this area up here, and up here, and up here, down there, and up there, down there, etc. There's a lot more surface area for us to contact food and do the job that we need to. Okay? And we know the small intestine is going to be a good place for digestion as well as absorption. So we find those in the small intestine. So that's just an example of a specialization of the wall in the small intestine. Okay, we also said that one of the key functions of the system is going to be movement. And so when we're talking about movement, there's going to be a couple different types of movement. There's going to be some movements that are going to be mixing movements. So those would be mechanical digestion, right? Like stomach churning, stuff like that. And then propelling movements are going to be, like I said, propulsion, or moving it along. And so one of the terms you'll see related to propelling movements is called peristalsis. And the peristalsis is this rhythmic contraction of the alimentary canal. So for instance, when you finish eating something, you push it back to your throat. Right, voluntarily, you kind of push it back to your throat, and then you're going to decide to swallow it, right? Once you do that motion, you can imagine that like the pharynx and the upper part of the esophagus is going to be skeletal muscle, because it's voluntary, right? You're telling the muscles where to put it, put it back there, send it down, stuff like that. But after that first move of the esophagus, it transitions into smooth muscle, right? And when you swallow something, especially big or very sharp, something like that, you can actually feel that everything contracts, right? You feel, oh, all the way down, like a corner of a chip or something like that. You're not actually, physically having to think about that, make sure it gets to the stomach, but you can feel that rhythmic squeezing. That's what peristalsis is. That's peristaltic contraction. And it's occurring everywhere along this whole descent line to make sure that the food is getting through. Okay? So we can see some of that over here on the right-hand side. So again, you see how circular muscle kind of squeezes it closed, and the longitudinal muscle moves it along there. And that peristaltic movement is going to occur everywhere along there, but we also see some mixing movements too. So when we're pitching it together, that's a little bit more of our type of mechanical digestion, like stomach churning, etc. Notice that in some cases we have an especially thick band of circular muscle. And the knee areas are areas that we can temporarily close off. So if we're doing mixing movements in the stomach, we want to close it off from the small intestine until it's ready to go there. We want to spend some time doing washing machine back and forth to the stomach without fear of it leaking out into the small intestine before we really have a chance to do our job in the stomach. Okay? So these are usually called sphincters. They're, again, fans of the smooth muscle. So this is called the lower esophageal sphincter. This is often called the pyloric sphincter. There's one that exists in the large intestine and the small intestine. It's called the ileocecal valve because it forms a junction between them and controls it. So there's lots of different ways that muscle is going to produce the digestive activity to really help with them. Okay. So, now what we're going to do, as I was suggesting before, we're going to do a bit of the tour through the system. So we're going to start at the mouth. So with the mouth, this is where ingestion is going to occur. We talked about that. There's definitely going to be decrease in there because we have mucus, right? This is part of our mucus line tract. We're going to have salivary glands that we're going to talk about too, which are accessory organs. They're going to dump in their secretions. We have teeth there, which are accessory organs, etc. And so we're going to begin a number of different digestive processes, and that includes mechanical digestion. So the chewing that you do is going to physically break apart the food, and that's actually called mastication. So, by that right, you are well in your right, and it's very polite to be able to masticate at the table in front of people. Everybody does it every day. Okay? So, the chewing is going to be a critical part, first step in breaking down the food. So here's some of our teeth, and we have people that are going into hygiene, stuff like that. People that are going into hygiene, they're going to learn so much more about teeth and about the mouth and stuff like that, etc. But for our purposes, we have our lips, we have the vestibules here. The vestibules are going to be these spaces here between the gums, also known as gingiva, and the lips. So these are going to be the vestibules here. Okay? The gingiva are going to be the gums, and then we've got our various types of teeth. And the teeth are good examples of, the link between function and form, because we have different types of teeth that will perform different types of bites, right? So the ones in the front, like the inside of the canine, are good for fighting pieces off of larger things that we're consuming. Meanwhile, you get towards the back, and they start to get broader and flatter, right? The premolars and molars. And the nose are good. They have great flat surfaces for crushing, for macerating, for really smashing it, okay? So they're shaped differently, but they have different functions. And so at first, we use front teeth, and then once you've been moving it around, we'll shift it backwards, and then we'll really start grinding and polarizing it. Okay, other than we see in the mouth, we have tongue, of course, which has many functions in a special sense, right? You have gustation there, we have taste buds in there. Some of our tonsils there are actually part of our immune system, where we have different types of white blood cells in there. We have the uvula here, which is that punching bag at the back of your throat. A lot of people still don't necessarily know why we have a uvula. The main idea is maybe so that when we swallow and things like that, the uvula is hanging down, goes up. And so they think maybe it goes up so that the food doesn't go up to the oral, or to the nasal pharynx and towards the nasal cavity. Maybe, right? It's not hanging out like that, not really an issue, so I don't know how weak the argument, but nobody really has a good idea about what that does. But if all the uvula, so now you can tell your friends, on the root of the mouth, we have hard palate, which is supported by bone, right? So by the maxillary bone and the palatine bone, and then as you move posteriorly, it becomes a soft palate and it transitions into the uvula. Okay, like I said, the tongue has those taste buds that are attached to the pathway. Those little bumps on the tongue that are called pathway. There's a few different types of them. Those are the types we mentioned before. Because we have the filiform ones, which are small little ones. They're a little more pointy. They're for traction. Cats have lots of those. Really big ones of those. And then there's fungiform, and then there's circumambulate. Only the bigger ones, the last two actually have taste buds in them. But when we look at the tongue, it's attached to the lower mouth by a connection called the frenulum. And because of the pathway, not only have taste buds, leave the larger ones, but they also give us some traction when we move around the mouth. On the diagram we saw there were some palatine tonsils, back of the hard palate. There's also lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue, and then the pharyngeal tonsils, right? Pharyngeal is like pharynx, which is back of the throat. And so pharyngeal tonsils are back of the throat, right between the nasal pharynx and the oral pharynx. So you have the way back there where you see those. Those are also called the adenoids. Now all the tonsils are part of our bodily defenses. So if you have a set of tonsils that are constantly getting infected or something like that, they will do tonsillectomy to remove those, knowing that we have others, as well as other parts of our bodily defenses to try to cover it. Okay? So here's our natural cover against all this in the respiratory system. So we're focused more up here previously. So now we see again our lips. You see the vestibule and here. You see the teeth. The tongue. This is where our lingual tonsils are located. These are going to be our palatine tonsils here, and then our pharyngeal tonsils are actually going to be back here like this. So food is going to come in. It's going to go past that root of the mouth, the hard palate, the soft palate, the uvula. It's going to go to the oral pharynx. goes down through the pharynx, and then gets shoved posteriorly into the esophagus, right? Because a lot of fluid is going to come down and cover the tracheus, so the food that's down there. Okay, so with those teeth, we're talking about the internal function of the teeth. We actually have two different sets of teeth. So we have what are called primary and secondary teeth based on which ones come first. There are only 20 primary teeth and 32 secondary teeth. So when you're younger, you're not quite doing much chewing and large macerating and things like that. So you don't need quite as many. And it's interesting because the teeth, the primary teeth are the baby teeth, right? And so they come in at the incisors. Usually your lower incisors, there's two sets of incisors. There's medial ones and then the lateral ones, okay? So you got 4 on the bottom and 4 on the top. And so you really start in the middle and lower, and then it goes one and the other, then it goes the other one and the other, and then it starts spreading out from there when you get primary teeth. And the interesting thing is, in terms of secondary teeth, if you ever look at an X-ray from a pediatric dentist or whatever, you can see all the primary here. You can see a lot of secondary teeth up here with like a sort of alien picture, all of the teeth are sharp or something like that. Yeah. 3 sets of teeth? Really? Yeah, I picture them in that? Really? You're going to do the show very much. You need to scribble on names and everything. Interesting. So, were you there long enough, like you getting any of the second ones in, and there was still someone behind?
Yeah, we were pulling over the teeth.
Yeah.
We saw that there were because of teeth for all the teeth.
Okay, how long was that?
Like
2 years. Yeah. That's interesting. I haven't heard about that before. That's not like a good go, right? When those secondary teeth come in, sometimes it can be painful, right? Because they're bigger and they make room and jaws and lining, stuff like that. And so I can imagine with tertiary teeth, you know, how that would be working. Anyway. So with our very teeth, they fall out into the order and then into coming in that same order, right? So you're going to get the baby teeth, the medial incisors, those are the first ones fall out, right? So if you think about it, first 2 teeth, you lose one down there, and they kind of falling out going that way, making room for the double teeth coming in. So those teeth form a inside of a joint, and then how we play the idea of what's called a periodontal ligament. And if you ever saw the movie Finding Nemo, right? It's all about dentist office, and all the kids are always wondering about dentists doing like tooling, using egg wax, stuff like that. And you'll hear, like from the power rise, you want to know if they loosen the periodontal ligament because they're doing extraction. So now you can understand the move that much more knowledge. So anyway, we said, different types of teeth. So here are incisors, right? A medial and lateral. You have one of these, which is going to be cusp, also known as canine. Then you've got 2 bicuspids, which are 3 molars, and these are adult teeth, and then 3 molars. So you've got the first, second, and the third molar. So these are 8 teeth you have on either side, and then top and bottom. So 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 gives us our 32. And so they usually, actually they didn't have a number of those. So there was a 1 through 32 in order to keep track of those, rather than say, you know, left medial inside, or they take a long area of the chart, you can use the number instead. And with the primary teeth, they use letters instead, because it gets to be bad. I don't know. They use 3 letters instead, they did like 3rd instead, I don't know what. Well, you imagine when you keep coming in and going out, right, that track, if they're medial incisor, now that's an old one, so they have to use a number for that one, number for that one, and that's the other one, so we can make it his or not. Okay, so we're looking at individual too. It's got different parts to it. It's got, if we talk about regions, it's got a root, like you see through here, and it's got a crown, which is up here. Okay, those are different regions, and in the crown, we've got layers. We've got the outermost layer, which is enamel, right? So this is the hardest stuff in the body, harder than bone. We have dentin, which is the tissue underneath it, which is also pretty hard, not quite hard. And then we have here, we have the pulp cavity, which turns into the root canal that goes into the root. It's a bit bigger through here, and then it narrows that goes into the root. So down below is called the root canal, which is almost always kind of funny because you're people talking about going and then oh, I get a root canal. True. Every two have a root canal or one already, right? The root canal, and you can see those blood vessels and the nerves that are coming into the tube. Go up to the pulp cavity and make sure that the living tissue, the density, is still living, right? Or nutrients, oxygen, all like that kind of thing. So, when you have a root canal, what happens is you've got some sort of infection, right? In essence, you got hair, you got a hole that's eating through the animal, it's eating its way into the density, and then has spread into the pulp cavity, right? So now, that infection, that bacterial infection, can actually become systemic, because now you can access this blood vessels which are going everywhere. And so what they're going to do is, right, they're going to go in there and they're going to drill this out, and then they're going to fill it with a synthetic material. So they're giving you a root canal, they're basically cleaning it out, filling it, so that the infection doesn't spread anymore. Now, still you're going to have liquids that are holding in place, but they've gotten rid of the infection that's gotten deep in there. Okay. So also now we have the salivary gland. The salivary gland put out the saliva, of course. And with the saliva, it's got water in it, it's got mucus in it, you can imagine. But another interesting thing is that for one or different salivary glands that come from the mouth, it actually has an enzyme in it, an enzyme called amylase. Now here's the thing, is that when we talk about chemistry, we talk about enzymes, and enzymes are made of proteins. And their whole role is to make chemical reactions occur easier, faster, that type of thing. Okay? What it does is it reduces the amount of energy that's necessary for this chemical reaction to go this and that. Okay? It doesn't like bind with the whatever the product is going to be and become part of it. It just facilitates it. Okay? So it's like oil in your car. Your engine runs on oil. Not very well, and there's oil in there, and these are going to move much easier. Okay? So as I do that, digestive enzymes facilitate the process of breaking chemical bonds and getting down to smaller components. So when we eat enzymes, your digestive enzymes are talking about chemical digestion. And so, in this slide we have, there's an enzyme called salivary amylase, and it helps you, or it starts to break down carbohydrates. Complex carbohydrates that we need to start breaking down into small segments. Okay? So this, for carbohydrates, this is the very first place you get chemical digestion. And for each of the molecules, they'll be a little bit different. Protein, like I said, starts with stomach. Fat is going to start going all the way down to the small intestine. In terms of chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion, sure. But chemical digestion for carbohydrates are way bigger than the salivary glands. Okay? Okay, so the salivary glands, when we look at them, there's actually different sets. There's big ones, or the broad salivary glands, which are staying here for years. These ones are eating something really sour. You can almost feel clean right here, your cheeks. Right? Because you're using something sour, really acidic, and your salivary glands are trying to remove it. And so they're trying to squeeze themselves and dump as much in there. And so you don't feel that this is squeezing this broad salivary gland. There's also mandibular ones, which are just underneath the jaw, underneath there, and sublingual ones, which are, as you imagine, underneath the tongue. And they have very extracellular glands that will stop that opening. The product ones are actually here instead, and the other ones are here, and then produce the secretion in that local area. So they have that like when we squeeze and stuff like that, they're coming from the lower salivary glands, etc. Okay. Now, one interesting thing about the salivary glands is they are innervated by both parasympathetic and sympathetic neurons. Parasympathetic represents digest, right? So anything that a lot of stimulation does, digest, taking you food, etc. Parasympathetic makes you not copious amounts of very watery mix of food, allow you to taste it, maybe you swallow, etc. If you're not eating something, or if you're stressed or something like that, then that stimulation disease will still and then put out saliva, but much thicker and more viscous saliva. So when you think about it, your nerves, you feel like, oh, I got a dry mouth and stuff like that. It's because there's that stimulation going to those salivary glands is causing it to put out different types of saliva. And so that's not the enzyme in it, you're not eating anything, it's much more, like I said, it's viscous and that. Okay. So go on. Mouth is very esophagus. Now, berries doesn't do much that work. Moving along, right? Back to the throat. Esophagus is basically the same. It's just transport from one area to another. Now, we talked about berries having three sections. Sections from the nose, sections from the mouth, sections down, or that's separated into areas. Now, hopefully, we're not getting into your nasopharynx. But the other sections we involved. So we get down to the esophagus, and then we're going to all down, right? We put it in the pharynx and tongue. Once the stress stays there, we're going to push it down with the pharynx and swallow, and go into the esophagus and get down to the stomach. Okay? So at the stomach, it's going to be a little bit more complexity there. We said, that small intestine may have a lot more going on, but stomach has at least a few different roles. Number one, it's a big bag that's going to allow us to store a lot of nutrients at once. So we can eat a big meal and then not eat for 3 or 4 hours, right? So you hear about people with lactation surgery and stuff like that. They actually put like a belt, a band around their stomach. It's a surgery that then is going to shrink the size of their stomach. And so in terms of reflexes, they're going to feel full a lot faster because the size of their stomach is now sitting down. And so they're not going to be able to eat as much at a time. They're going to eat less, right? So the stomach is a storage organ to be sure, allowing you to eat a bunch and then process it a little bit through time. But we're also going to find that there is some digestion that goes on there, and some absorption, a little bit of absorption. But for the most part, nutrients will be taken in, and they're not had time to be broken down enough that we're going to be pulling them across the body wall. Okay? So here's the stomach, a big shaped stomach. It sits on the left-hand side. You see the esophagus coming down to it. It's got a big kind of storage area here called the fundus, the main body. And then it's got the pylorus where it narrows down. Here's that pyloric sphincter that I mentioned, which regulates the flow into the small intestine for essentially being the duodenum. You can also see all these wrinkles in here. These are called rugae. And the rugae are wrinkles that allow the stomach to be able to stretch. And so, in theory, some people say that sometimes you stretch like 2.5 meters or something like that, right? 2-meter bottle and stuff like that. Bigger than that. And when it's that small, it's only something bigger than the small intestine or the esophagus or something like that. So it has the amazing ability to be able to stretch and still function and move and things move around. Now in terms of the stomach, like I said, one of the main jobs is to just hold food, be a temporary storage area for food. But when it's actively working, what's going to happen is we've got lots of secretion that goes on there. Now we're going to have mucus secretion, right? But we're also going to have specialized secretions from other cells. We have these cells that are called Breyer's cells, and they put out the HCl. You know what acid? Hydrochloric acid, right? So that's the gas you use. That's the stomach acid we were talking about before. It's like CH2. That HCl only goes from 0 to 14. That's pretty darn acidic. Now, luckily, there's a lot of layer cells lining the inside of the stomach. And so they can withstand that acid. Usually they have tight junctions in those so that the acid can't actually have much effect on them. There's lots of different ways that the stomach is protected by the hydrochloric acid. But other sections of the digestive system aren't. So if you have acid reflux, then you're giving the hydrochloric acid up into your esophagus, and the esophagus doesn't have the same anatomical protections. So you get holes in your esophagus, etc. The other thing is, we've got a set of cells that are called cheek cells. And cheek cells put out an enzyme that's called pepsin. And pepsin is enzyme that helps to digest proteins. So we saw amylase coming in by salivary glands up in the mouth. Carbohydrates were getting their turn starting. Now we're seeing proteins starting to get their turn in chemical digestion. Now that pepsin only becomes active when it's at a low pH. So the whole idea with that hydrochloric acid is not only does it help you kind of degrade these molecules, but it activates that pepsin. Technically, when it's secreted, it's called pepsinogen, like that fibrinogen I'm talking about with blood clotting. So it's got an inactive form, but when you put it in the presence of hydrochloric acid, then it becomes active and you can start slicing and digesting those proteins. Okay. We also have some what's called intrinsic factors that get secreted there too that helps you to absorb vitamin B12 later on. And so there's a lot of things that are going to be secreted there. Now what I would say is that what we've been doing so far is we've been kind of making our way down, looking at these different digestive organs, and talking about how they contribute. We've done a good job of getting down to the stomach, and we're mostly ways through the stomach, but there's a little bit more information talking about kind of how does the stomach go, when it's supposed to secrete things, when it's supposed to move things on, etc. So talking a little bit about hormones and kind of nerves and stuff like that. That's probably a little bit more complex than we're going to want to get into. Like they had an exam. Okay? So what I would say is, we'll stop here for today.